Detroit city officials make a last-ditch attempt to stop an almost certain takeover of the city's finances by the state of Michigan. But are such moves really necessary? And do citizens risk being further marginalized by corporate interests? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. A declining population, high crime, crumbling neighborhoods. The problems of Detroit have been well documented over recent years. But now the city's facing its toughest challenge yet. On Tuesday, city council officials appealed against a move to let the state of Michigan take over Detroit's finances. The proposal by Michigan's Republican governor, Rick Snyder, would make Detroit the largest American city ever taken over by its state. It would see an appointed emergency manager installed, someone with virtually unchecked power to gut union contracts, cut employee health insurance, and slash services. Some councillors also argue it would leave the mainly African-American city without democratically elected representatives. Diane Easterbrook reports from Detroit.
You guys must fight. You got to take this to the federal level.
At this Detroit City Council meeting, furious residents railed against a proposed takeover by the state of Michigan.
We are treated like second-class citizens.
The outrage is over the governor's plan to appoint an emergency manager to handle Detroit's financial crisis, a move that effectively strips the mayor and city council of power. The state made the decision after Detroit failed to come up with an adequate plan to solve a nearly $330 million deficit.
The current system has not been working. We have not stopped the decline.
The governor's decision is also spilling onto the streets of Detroit.
The city getting the emergency manager is nothing but a plantation owner.
Emergency managers have taken over other Michigan cities in recent years with mixed results. But Detroit's sheer size and complicated past could make this appointment a challenge.
Race riots in the 1960s sparked the city's half-century of decline. That was followed by white flight to the suburbs, the downturn in the U.S. auto industry, and political corruption. While population loss has left much of Detroit littered with abandoned homes and businesses, the city has revitalized its downtown in recent years, attracting new companies and residents. Still, some business owners like Grant Lancaster question whether Detroit can solve its money problems.
I think the city needs to move forward, and it's been hard for them to do it with what we have, with the mayor and the 9 council members that we have. And not even just this mayor, but, previous mayors and city councils before.
The city argues it tried to work with the state to reduce its deficit and partly blames Michigan for withholding much-needed tax revenue. Veteran council member Kwame Kenyatta thinks the state's action is a violation of the city's rights and those of its citizens.
When you elect individuals who cannot solve the problem, you recall them or you elect new individuals who can solve the problem.
Detroit may still appeal the governor's decision, but it could be in for a very tough fight. Diane Easterbrook, Al Jazeera, Detroit.
And joining me to discuss whether a state takeover of Detroit's finances is really in residents' interests are, from Detroit, Darrell Dorsey, journalist, author and columnist for the Deadline Detroit news website. Betty Buss, a former supervising budget analyst for the city of Detroit. And from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Chris Savage of ecollectorblog.com, a progressive news and political commentary website. Darrell Dorsey, first of all, I think what we heard there was a pretty standard, very brief, potted history of Detroit. I wonder, though, whether the story might be a little bit more complicated. How did we get here, Darrell?
Well, I'd just like to point out, first off, that when we talk about the decline of population here in Detroit, it's very important that people understand that it precedes the riots in the 1960s. You had people leaving Detroit in the late 1940s, early 1950s, as a result of housing policy. Federal housing policy made it possible for many white Americans to leave the city and to buy homes in the suburbs. Many African Americans were denied these same opportunities through FHA loans, discriminatory policies by the federal government that pretty much left African Americans in a state of stasis in the city in terms of being able to move around. So so it's very important to point out that Detroit began to lose population as a result of social engineering, quite frankly, as a result of federal housing policies that refused to allow African Americans to move and made a lot of opportunities for whites in Detroit to buy homes in the inner ring suburbs. It's also important to point out that that the problems in terms of corruption certainly do predate the 1960s. We've had problems with corruption here. We've had mayors going to jail here for years before that. And just like many other big cities, I don't think Detroit is any different in that respect. So I think the things that are important is that people understand we didn't get here just because of riots. We got here also because of federal policy. We got here as a result of, like I said before, social engineering in many respects. And I think that anybody who's going to understand what present-day Detroit is about, it's very important that they understand sort of the roots of the past and the foundation that created some of these problems.
Chris Savage, is there a sense, though, that more recent economic policy, though, did exacerbate some of those long-held problems, especially as regards the auto industry and foreign outsourcing and things like that, though?
You can't deny the impact that's had on all of the failing cities in Michigan. We are, I think some people say, or it's been said that up to 60% of the jobs in Michigan are some way tied to the automotive industry, and the demise of the automotive industry in the 70s and the 80s and beyond has had a tremendous impact, and it's had an impact on all of the other cities now that have emergency financial managers, including Pontiac and Flint and others. So yeah, that's had a major impact for sure.
And Betty Buss, as far as the financial troubles of Detroit are concerned, that's nothing new either.
Absolutely not, although the city has had serious financial problems in the past. In fact, the city's had deficits in 43 of the last 63 years. The city's financial problems now are much more severe, and when you look at the tax base erosion that has occurred in Detroit, whether it's population, whether it's the number of businesses that have moved out, whether it's the amount of vacant land the city now has, these challenges are just huge. And I think it's helpful to understand how they developed. The problem now is what options are available to solve these problems. And the options are fairly limited.
All right. Well,
and unfortunately, none of them are particularly good options at this point in time.
And we'll run through those options in a second, but I wonder, as we're talking about how man-made perhaps this crisis is, I wonder, Darrell Dorsey, I mean, there is a charge that it was further exacerbated, the economic problems of Detroit, on purpose, perhaps, in some ways, by the policies of the Michigan governor who, I mean, I suppose it's that kind of Naomi Klein disaster capitalist kind of model, of trying to create perhaps a crisis of withholding revenues and cutting corporate taxes, having an emergency, and then, putting in place or suggesting, well, actually, in that case, we need an emergency manager. Does that sound credible, though?
It does. I mean, certainly Rick Snyder has helped to exacerbate some of the problems by not allowing revenue sharing, which is something that many of the cities around the state, many of the municipalities have been depending on. We pay into the system, and we expect to get monies back to help the help cities and towns.
Revenue sharing
we'll let you in a
go
second.
back 10 years.
We'll let Darrell just finish his thoughts, and then we'll have you in, Betty.
But even prior to the installation, the election of Rick Snyder, I think that there were problems in terms of at the federal level. Everybody talks about Detroit not recovering from the riots. I think Detroit's never really recovered from Reaganomics, to be quite honest with you. There was a massive disinvestment from cities in the early, mid, and late 1980s. There were harsh Republican policies that were directed at Detroit. I think that Detroit was in some ways singled out. The former mayor of Detroit, Coleman A. Young, had a notably contentious relationship with Ronald Reagan. He once called him old prune face. So these two, I think, had a lot of personal differences, a lot of personal conflicts, and I think that some of that got taken out on Detroit as a result via federal policies of disinvestment or not investing as heavily as we should. Detroit is an American city, And I think that, you know, to the degree that it is an American city, it is America's responsibility to help take care of it, to help make sure that it thrives.
Okay.
And I think that there was some recession of will and of help.
Betty Buss, what do you make of that idea, though, that frankly, certainly some on the right had enough of Detroit and certainly had enough of the union power and other things within Detroit? So there was this conscious effort to starve the city even further of funds and then declare an emergency.
I think we have to understand what a difficult decade this has been for the whole state. And that the revenue sharing cuts certainly had a huge impact on the city of Detroit. They've had a huge impact on every city, village, and township in the state. But because Detroit gets 58% of statutory revenue sharing, those problems were exacerbated in the city. Nonetheless, the city does get 58% of statutory revenue sharing, even though the city only has 7%, now about 7% of the state's population. So I think we need to look at this in a broader context of what's going on in Michigan, right, as well as what's going on in the city of Detroit.
Chris Savage.
And I would make the point, the very specific point, that the revenue sharing cuts that have so decimated all of our local governments in the state didn't start with this governor. They started with the economic problems in the state a decade ago.
Right. Chris Savage, as we look at the numbers, though, that are often repeated, $330 million deficit, $14 billion in long-term debt, this is for Detroit. Are these numbers necessarily accurate or are they overstated? Again, I've seen arguments that perhaps some, specifically in the media, perhaps tend to overstate these numbers in a bid to make the case for an emergency manager.
Well, I wouldn't claim to be a CPA, but there are at least 3 people that are running for mayor of Detroit right now who would vigorously argue against those numbers and say that Detroit is in far better shape. And, you know, as far as the revenue sharing goes, $150 million a year out of their budget due to revenue sharing cuts is not trivial. And while Detroit may get a somewhat larger share than other cities, it also represents a huge population center and a huge economic center for Michigan. So it's worth our while to make sure that Detroit is doing well. And I don't think we've done that. And what I see with the emergency managers is somebody being sent in with the tools of cutting and slashing and no tools of building and constructing. And what we need to do is rebuild Detroit. And it's going to take a hard work to do that. I'm not saying that it's easy. And I know that there are relationships that need to be rebuilt. But the relationships right now are so corrosive that until we get some change there, it's going to be a really big struggle to go forward. And I put that on both sides, Detroit and the state as well. But the Snyder administration has exacerbated things by their approach to things. And this idea with the new emergency manager law that came in under Public Act 4, which was then repealed and has now been put back in place under a slightly different guise, to suggest that the unions are responsible for this and that we're going to fix this by eviscerating the unions, it's just laughable, because you could probably eliminate every union salary in the entire city and still be in serious trouble.
Chris, you raise an interesting point there about the tortuous history of these public acts, Public Act 72, Public Act 4, Public Act 436. Darrell, I mean, isn't that the point that the last time this type of action of employing an emergency manager was put to the test of voters, it was actually kicked out both at the state and city-wide level. So how come it's back?
Well, it's back, frankly, because it's been installed by people who I don't think really care much for democracy. They think of democracy as an obstruction, as a hindrance to their political agenda.
So 82% voted against this.
82% of Detroiters voted against Public Act 4. 52%, I believe, of Michiganders statewide voted against Public Act 4. People do not want emergency managers in their towns. I mean, and there's also the overwhelming reality of the fact that emergency managers, generally speaking, have not worked. I mean, there aren't, you know, any real concrete examples of these emergency managers actually doing anything positive.
We have a brief summary, actually.
We had
of some of those takeovers.
We had a situation. Yeah, well, we had a situation in Detroit where the state took over the schools, took over the school board back in the late 1990s. They actually have been in charge, the state, of the Detroit public schools for the vast majority of the past decade and change.
Well, let's run through some of the other examples.
All they've done is help to create deficits. I'm sorry?
Let's quickly run through the other examples, actually. I mean, there have been a series of local financial emergencies since 1990. And right now, the cities of Flint, Benton Harbor, Pontiac and Course are all under the supervision of the state. Also, as Darrell alluded to, school districts in Detroit and Highland Park have a state-appointed emergency financial manager. State-appointed financial managers have widespread powers to cut city spending, change contracts with labor unions, eliminate entire city departments or sell city properties, all without the consent of local officials or residents. This is possible because there's no right to local government enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. And then looking at their record and how effective these emergency interventions have actually been elsewhere in Michigan, the city of Highland Park was first taken over by the state in 2001, but the first emergency fund manager was sacked after it was discovered that he took unauthorized payments. He'd publicly agreed to a salary of $1. Now it's back in debt and is an emergency fund manager for the city's schools. The city of Hamtramck's finances were under the state's control from 2000 to 2007, but in 2010 it went back into the red and was forced to declare bankruptcy. The city of Pontiac got an emergency manager in 2011. Lou Schimmel has faced criticism for outsourcing police services and privatizing major city departments. The city's public employee workforce has also been cut by 90%. Flint, Michigan had an emergency manager from 2002 to 2004. That didn't help much at all. It now has yet another emergency manager in place, and it currently faces a budget deficit of up to $20 million. Betty Buss, I mean, that sort of record is what leads some to wonder whether this is more about some sort of ideological push, an ideological framework of how society should be, rather than what actually works if you're trying to recreate your tax base and recreate a thriving middle class.
Well, I think there's two big issues here. One is that the city government's finances really are a symbol and indicator of what's happening in the economy of the city. And until you can rebuild the economy, you're really playing a short-term game, because unless you can rebuild that tax base, all you can do is cut, and that just exacerbates what's going on in your economy. The other issue is, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are bankruptcy, in which everyone gets hurt except the lawyers, some kind of standoff, non-intervention scenario in which your vendors, your retirees, your bondholders individually sue the city because the city's not able to meet its contractual obligations, or the city officials themselves taking control and doing what has to be done to balance the budget and to meet those contractual obligations. There aren't any good solutions when the mayor and the council have demonstrated that they're not able
Chris Savage.
to do what needs to be done.
I would say that Betty just made a great argument against the use of emergency financial managers, in that they do not have the tools to rebuild local economies. And I personally believe that Detroit does need to go into a bankruptcy situation, because at least they maintain local democracy, and it prevents the financial manager from selling off local public assets as well. So those two things are preserved under a managed bankruptcy. Those are the things that that are sort of the bedrock of our society, and it's an important thing. When you say that everybody gets hurt, everybody's going to get hurt anyway. And I think that it needs to be that's the kind of incentive that needs to happen in order to push the state to do more, something creative, to get in there and start rebuilding these things. And you cannot do it simply by going in and so-called balancing the books, because what happens is exactly what's happened in Hamtramck and in Benton Harbor and all these other places where financial managers have not been successful in creating a sustainable economy in the local area.
Betty Buss, balancing the books is good for bondholders, but it does nothing for the long-term development of a society or an economy.
That is the challenge, is how you make those long-term changes that allow the local government to function effectively, because the tax base is sufficient at reasonable rates to provide the revenues that you need to provide services to your citizens. That's the long-term challenge.
Right.
The short-term challenge is making revenues and expenditures balanced, but unless you address the economy, every year you're going to have to cut more.
So Darrell Dorsey, have we heard anything from officials suggesting that this emergency manager will do anything other than slash and cut and privatize and will be looking at the long-term
No, I haven't heard anything in terms of any kind of creative revenue-generating ideas. In fact, part of the problem with this whole thing with cutting is they're just cutting across the board. You know, Detroit does have a tax department. They have people who do inspections. There are ways to generate revenue. You know, I don't think that, I agree that a managed bankruptcy is probably the best thing at this point. One of my big problems with the emergency manager is that I think that it's really a stopgap by pro-business, pro-corporate forces in Lansing who are just trying to get folks set up to be able to take advantage of a bankruptcy in Detroit, whereas they might not be
attractive
as well
about
positioned
Detroit
right now.
Darrell, I mean, are there any particular prizes?
Well, I mean, there are assets here. I mean, there are assets. Detroit has its own water department, which has been heavily coveted by outstate forces, suburban forces. It's owned by the city of Detroit. It's operated by the city of Detroit. I mean, even before they've installed an emergency manager, there's already a plan afoot to try and take Detroit's water department. And this has been a big deal. They're creating a situation wherein you're supposed to think that the water department is not self-sustaining, but it is. The water department is fine. There's nothing wrong with the Detroit Water Department. It's totally capable of generating revenue. It is a revenue-generating asset. It is considered one of the best water departments in the world. Detroit has some of the best water in the world, certainly in the country. There's no reason for these folks to come in and try and spin off Detroit's water department into some kind of regional authority, other than the fact that these people who are running out of new markets that they can exploit want to be able to come in and exploit municipal assets. I mean, that's what a lot of this, if you ask me, is really all about. I don't think that there's any genuine concern for the people of the city of Detroit. I think that there's a real concern for Detroit's assets and what the state can get out of it.
In that case, how can this be seen as a good short-term plan when, in fact, it's probably just making a lot of money for a few well-connected corporations, arguably, and in the long term will cause an even greater problem and down the line then?
There is a plan on the table, and I don't know how far it's gone or whether it's going to go any further, but there is a plan that has been proposed that would have the city lease the water and sewer department to a regional authority and then have the water and sewer department pay the city general fund $50 million a year in payment in lieu of taxes. Right now, the water and sewer department is totally self-supporting, but it does not generate any revenues for the general fund, and the general fund is that portion of the city government that includes police and fire and parks and rec and public lighting and all of those kinds of direct services to residents. So the proposal, the most recent proposal that I've seen, would allow that resource, which is the water and sewer department, to generate $50 million a year in operating revenues for the city government. Right. Whether that's going to work, I have no idea.
Actually, I wonder, on a side point, Chris Savage, I mean, that figure that we used of $14 billion long-term debt, that includes the self-sustaining water department, doesn't it? So that's another reason why that figure doesn't mean anything.
That includes about $6 billion of water and sewer debt.
Right. So, Chris Savage, what do you make of that? That suggests there are these kind of rational plans that aren't simply about gouging and profit-making and Wall Street. There are about Detroit.
There are, and I have been critical to some extent of the City Council of Detroit for not taking advantage of those. One is to turn Belle Isle, for example, into a state park, which I thought was a terrific way for them to see some revenues coming in and actually bring some tourism dollars into Detroit. But I think you really need to take a 10,000-foot view here. When the Snyder administration came in, and along with the Republicans that swept in 2010, they very quickly took $2 billion out of our state budget and gave it away as tax breaks for corporations, for businesses,
sort of Wisconsin
as a way to attract
business. Yeah.
Right, as a way to attract businesses into Michigan. Now that's all well and fine if it works, but the problem is that if you're a business looking at Michigan, looking at where to set up, where are you going to set up? Are you going to set up in Benton Harbor? Are you going to set up in Detroit or Flint or Pontiac?
All right.
No, you're not, because the infrastructure there is crumbling.
Darrell Dorsey, last word, we've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, I think it's also important to point out that there's a racial component to this. As Chris has pointed out on his excellent blog, Eclectic blog, you're looking at about 50% of African Americans statewide now being under some form of consent decree or an emergency manager if the plan for Detroit goes through. I think that, you know, that is a wholesale robbery of people's democratic right to elect their government, and I think it's a way of disenfranchising folks and getting people out of the way so that you can push forward a very regressive and draconian right-wing agenda.
Have to leave it there. Darrell Dorsey, thank you so much. Chris Savage, thank you. Betty Buss, thank you very much as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.